Hey there, welcome to Blockhead, the podcast where cartoonists talk comics and just about everything else. My name is Geoff Grogan. I'm a cartoonist, animator, and illustrator, and for the next hour or so, I'll be your host in a series of conversations with comics creators about their lives, their work, and comics. So sit back and enjoy. Hello, welcome to a brand new episode of Blockhead. This is our first episode of a brand new year, so Happy New Year to everyone who's out there listening, and welcome to 2025. I hope your holiday season was a joyous one, and I hope your new year will be a great one for you and for all your loved ones, wherever they may be. Today, we are celebrating this brand new book called How Comics Were Made by Glenn Fleishman, a visual history from the drawing board to the printed page. This is an incredibly wonderful new book that fills in a big gap in the history of comics, the history of printing. It's like there was in the history of comics. We have all of the discussions of the great comics creators and each of their creations and how it developed and its popularity and where it was printed and all those kinds of things. So we know about the Yellow Kid, and we know all the way Little Nemo, and we know Crazy Cat, and blah blah blah, and on and on and on. Well, this piece of the puzzle has been missing, and that is how did it go from the artist's drawing board to the hand of the reader in newsprint? How did it get there? And how did that journey change over the course of 150 years? There were technological developments, there were all kinds of changes. How did that happen? And this is the book that fills in that big, huge gap in the history of comics and really the history of newspapers. It walks us through that whole process of how the comics went from, the illustration board or Bristol board on the drawing table of the cartoonist, and how it gets into newsprint and into the hand of the reader. How did it get there? This is the story, and it's an incredible story. You'll really be bowled over by the detail that Glenn has dug up here, and the incredible illustrations that illustrate every step of the story, every step of the way, how everything changed over the course of 150 years. It's incredible. It really is incredible. I was knocked out by all of the detail and all of the new vocabulary terms and everything that's there. It's a wonderful book, and it's beautifully illustrated, and it's got some great stuff that every comics lover is going to love. There's Peanuts material you've never seen before. There's Doonesbury material you've never seen before. There's all kinds of color separations and mechanicals throughout, from the Hernandez brothers and from Lynn Johnston, and all kinds of wonderful stuff throughout here. And it's just a great book. It is a joy to have. It was a big success on Kickstarter last winter, I believe it was. Huge success, and now it's going to be reprinted in a brand new edition from Andrews McMeel in this coming year, I believe. So be on the lookout for that if you missed out on the Kickstarter, because this is a great book, and any person who loves comics history should not be without it. It should be on every shelf in every library. It's incredible. Really is incredible. I got to tell you, every time I open it up, there's a brand new surprise, brand new information to glean from it, and I just can't recommend it enough. How Comics Were Made by Glenn Fleishman. We're going to celebrate that right now with an interview with the author himself, with Glenn, and so sit back and enjoy, and get your notepad out, because you're going to be taking down some terms you've probably never heard before, and looking for a glossary somewhere for a definition. But if you get this book, you'll learn it all. So it's a joy to read. So without further ado then, Glenn Fleishman and myself in conversation. I will be back with you at the end of the show. See you then. So you're in California?
Seattle.
Oh, Seattle. Oh,
excellent. Yeah.
Okay.
Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
The old Pacific time zone.
Oh, excellent. And whereabouts are you? In the city, or are you outside the city?
Yeah, I did the thing. That's the advice I give to every young person today: is buy a house 30 years ago,
Yeah, right.
which they love to hear. And I try to
Yeah,
be
right.
sympathetic because it's so terrible, right? But no, I moved here in the 90s, and housing was cheap, and I bought a house in what was then an unfashionable network or neighborhood in which a lot of grad students and professors rented, and now it's all .com people have all risen up around me. But it's right near the university. We're right across the Montlake Bridge, or sorry, the university. I'm sorry, the Montlake Bridge. University Bridge isn't that far away, so we can go across the Montlake Bridge and be right at University of Washington.
Oh, nice, nice.
It's confusing. The University Bridge is actually not the one that's closest to the university, of course, just to be sensible, because they changed, made the names 80 years ago. We have 3 bascule bridges in Seattle. That's one of our trademarks.
Bascule? And
yeah, they're counterweighted as opposed to drawbridges are lifted up.
Yes.
The bascule has the counterweight underneath that the weight is used to. So it's almost like it floats. There's no. So it's they use a very small amount of motor power to cantilever it up and down.
Oh wow!
It's funny. There's not that many, I gather, and we have 3.
Wow.
And there's bridge tenders at all of them 24 hours a day. It's a really funny little kind of maritime history part of the the community.
Yeah, it is very interesting. It's very unique. I'm gonna have to get a visual of that. I'm gonna have to check that out because I wasn't aware of that. Why don't I just introduce you? And introduce the book.
Oh, yeah. Do you want me to record on my end, or are you?
I'm fine.
You're good? Okay, all right.
Yeah, if you want to record it for your own posterity, that's fine.
No, that's good. As long as you're happy, I'm good. If I sound good, then that's great.
Yeah, and if you want a copy of the file, I can send it to you too. So that's no problem. So ladies and gentlemen, Blockhead listeners, welcome to a new episode of Blockhead. Today's guest is Glenn Fleishman, who is the author of this extraordinary new history of comics and printing. Glenn Fleishman is the author of this wonderful book, How Comics Were Made, which was a Kickstarter not too long ago. I think this was over the summer. Or was it early fall?
Just over, almost a year. It was in February.
It was that long ago.
February and March. So, I had a lot of stuff sketched out and was kind of ready to go, but I needed to make sure people actually wanted it.
Oh, well, yeah, but it turns out I think people wanted it in droves, right? It was very popular, was it not?
It was wild. I was so gratified because this is kind of it's a weird idea. Like I'd started in finding out from the printing history end. I have a background in typesetting and design. I've worked as a journalist, but I was kind of trying to get back to my printing roots, and freelance journalism is unfortunately terrible business these days. And so I'm like, I should go back to the stuff that I love. What could I do with that decades after I'd spent years working in the field? And I really dig the history of things. And so as I'm digging into history, printing and doing some letterpress printing and finding new projects and writing, and went to London and visited all these type archives and did all this stuff, I keep encountering these beautiful printing artifacts. They're like ephemeral pieces of printing history that weren't the original item that was being produced, and they weren't the final item. They were these intermediate stages. And I know people in the comics world were more aware of some of them, like color guides, which are really cool because often the artist does them. And a color guide is a lot more affordable than an original piece of art. But there's all this material after the color guide and before the actual printed newsprint or book. Kept coming across these, and I started to then find that I was finding general printing stuff like newspaper molds and things like that, printing molds. And then I see, there's a treasure trove of comics related material, because most of this was thrown away. Most of the printing materials during the metal age, particularly, which lasted centuries, there was a substance called flong, was the old name. It's a paper mold, which you can find throughout the book.
Yes.
It's a paper-like mold. They would burn those at the end of the day, or some people use them. There are houses insulated with flong, and I found ads when I was researching this book. It didn't make it into this book. Some other book it will. There's like a report from Spokane, a news report from 20 2015 or 2010, this couple starts pulling off the siding of an old house they bought that they're renovating, and it's covered with newspapers, but they don't recognize what it is. They call the newspaper, and somebody there's like, "Oh yeah, those are mats or flongs," and somebody worked at the paper. Well, as I start to research it, it turns out newspapers for decades said, "Hey, you can come and buy our used flongs. They're really good insulating material, particularly for chicken coops." And whatever, but you could insulate your house for them. So you can find these ads all over, and it was a way for them to recoup some of the expense because otherwise they burned or trashed them.
Sure.
But the comics related stuff that persisted because people cared about it, and they'd think maybe like I have this amazing Doonesbury flong. It's 6 daily strips in
Right.
one piece that never ran in print. And
Right.
I'm thinking somebody saw this, said this is meaningful. Maybe it'll be worth something, or I love Doonesbury. I'm going to hold on to it. And for 50 years, it sat in one or more people's basements or whatever, and then they put it up on eBay.
Hmm.
So as I continued to find this, I thought I really want to do a book about this. I spent a lot of time at the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library Museum looking at they have printing materials, but a lot of other stuff. And I go out to I launch a website, I start talking to people, I start interviewing cartoonists, and I'm thinking, gosh, to do this right, I have to hire a designer because there's so much work. I can't write and design it at the same time. And I think I have to go to Kickstarter and ask for $150,000. And that felt like a huge lift. Like, are people really going to back it? In the end, I raised nearly $170,000, and
That's
I was
unbelievable.
emotionally like just a wreck because like this is incredible. And then of course, I printed more than I need. So as the years gone on, it's actually been a way. It's as somebody whose career in journalism, the freelance market kind of disappeared under me. This has been a new, whole new direction that I'm doing as part of making my living. So
Yes.
anyway, wonderful experience. I have like the optimal crowdfunding experience.
Yeah, you sure did. And I'm imagining that some of the things you found on eBay, the flongs and whatnot, are becoming more scarce because of the book. Because now people know what they are, and they're like, "Oh my God, there's got to be more flongs for Doonesbury. There's got to be more flongs for EC Cigar. There's flongs for everybody." You
Oh
know,
yeah. Well, and people are
everybody's
digging
searching them
through their
out.
collections. Yeah, I mean, you might like people now. Once you identify something, people get excited about it,
Yes.
and then also I am seeing higher prices, particularly the metal
Oh no.
plates, which are, they're called. There's zinc version, which was used to make the flongs, so it's
Yes.
harder, and then
Mhm.
there's the lead alloy versions, which are called stereotypes, which were cast from these paper-like molds. And actually have a full. It's in the book, pictures of it. It's a 40-pound full semi-cylindrical plate
Oh, it's
that was used a
incredible.
comics page, and I think it's one of I know at least of one other, and I think John, whose name I'm forgetting, who does Dummy Magazine rather, I think he has a full comics page in that form, but it's kind of like the detritus, like the flotsam and jetsam that washed up on the shore of printing history, and only a tiny fraction, 1 billion flongs were used in newspapers. It's some ridiculous number,
Yeah, I'm
and,
sure.
and maybe tens of thousands survive, and maybe thousands of them are in a collection someplace. And the Billy Ireland has a lot of metal for a particular reason, and a little bit of these paper flongs or mats. But yeah, I go on eBay now and I'll see like Tubby will be or not Tubby. What's it? The strip is
Nancy? Oh
no,
no,
no.
no.
Is it Tubby? It's
Uh, I'm
Wash
trying to
Tub,
think.
something like that. It's one of the old ones, and it's $100, and it's kind of an average strip, and it's an average metal plate. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to pay $100 for that. In the past, I might have paid $20 or $30. So, and I'm seeing flongs go up. So I'm hoping people are going through their collections and going, oh, maybe we could monetize this, or going to the Billy Ireland, for instance, and saying, hey, can we donate this material to
Yeah,
you?
even better.
Um, I have heard from a couple people who said, "Hey, can you put me in touch with them?" And I'm like, "Well, I don't need to be their go-between. I mean, I'm happy to, but here's how you reach them." And they've hired Billy Ireland just hired a full-time acquisitions person recently. I just got a postcard from them,
Hmm.
so they hopefully will be interested in acquiring some of this material as well.
Yeah, I hope so. I'm sure they will be. This is well, it points to one of the things that interested me about this, and that is that this is an entirely like untouched area of comics history and newspaper history that hasn't been written. But everybody, it's kind of interesting because anybody who's ever worked, anybody our age or older or whatnot, who's seen the transition from, traditional print to digital and whatnot, is somewhat aware of these things, particularly anybody who's worked in any area of production or whatnot. But so we were all aware of it, but it was like a it was like a verbal or a vocal history, but it was never
Hmm.
written. And so this whole piece of the puzzle has for in comics history and also newspaper history was just missing, you know. I mean, and all of a sudden, this book just fills that void, which is a huge void. I mean, when you think about it, that we went this long without this book is really kind of remarkable. It just because when I saw that you were doing this, and at the time I couldn't contribute to the Kickstarter because I was kind of money was a little bit tight at the
I
moment.
understand.
But
Book is expensive too,
yeah,
unfortunately.
it was an expensive one, but it was so great that all these folks, probably mostly cartoonists or people in the industry or whatnot, all said this is an essential piece of the puzzle. It's got to happen. And I think it's remarkable. It's a great book, and it's a great contribution to
Thank
comics
you so
history
much.
and newspaper
This
history.
this is the book that I kept looking for because I assumed that somebody at some time had written it, and so I dig up like How to Read Nancy, and those guys are amazing, right? Who wrote
Yes,
that? And
right.
I flipped through it, and it's such an amazing book. And at the end, they're like, "Hey, here's how they were made." And there's a couple pages, and there's pictures. I'm like, "Oh yeah, okay, they knew." And then I'll pick up, oh I don't know, there's excerpts in there from Popular Science and Popular Mechanics, which each ran one in 1927 and one in 1940, I think is the year. Both publications ran these extensive photographically illustrated explanations of how comics were made. But those are like the two that I can find, at least through digital research and otherwise. And the funny thing is, if I had like sort of infinite time, it feels like every newspaper at some point in their history, and often every several years, would run an article like, "Hey, do you want to know how our newspaper is made?" And
Yeah,
they'd take pictures and whatever. And so I have a subscription to newspapers.com and newspaperarchive.com.
cool.
Both my best friend for contemporary research is both of those. And I'll search on something like Flong, or I'll search on aspects of like color separation. That's where there's a couple images in the book that are really bad, obviously microfilm transferred newspaper
Yes.
photos, and it's the best thing I could find. But I found one photo of somebody handling with their name even attached. So often these people are unnamed workers. So the stereotyper with the 4-color plates for color Sunday printing, and another somebody making up a page, like literally putting metal comics onto a page to lock it together for printing. And those, as to my knowledge, are the only two images of comic production in metal newspapers in those stages that exist. And it's just through going. So if I did more research, I'm sure I could find maybe original newspapers, scan those at higher quality. In some cases, the images, I mean, there's fair use and there's public domain and there's copyright. So in some cases, I used images that could not find an owner, or it was clearly a fair use case because it's demonstrating something for scholastic purposes. But it's just, it wasn't very much documentation. One of the greatest things I came across was a 1993 book called The Funny Papers. And it's a book, I have it here somewhere. I've got the author's name, but the photographer is that it turns out to be the daughter of Mitch Miller. Her name is Margie Miller. Margie Miller Ruther is her name. And she and I
The daughter of Mitch
w-
Miller.
I know, that's right. Mitch Miller only died about 15 years ago. The guy lived to 90 something.
Wow.
Isn't that amazing?
It
It's
is
not like
amazing.
another, it feels like 2 generations ago, like when we were
Yeah.
kids or
When
something,
we
right?
were kids, yeah.
Yeah.
Mitch Miller,
I mean,
for those who
so
don't know, Mitch Miller
us,
used to lead a chorus line of these ridiculous people singing popular songs in this really corny style, very almost like barbershop quartet style.
sing along with Mitch
Sing along
Miller,
with
right?
Mitch with a bouncing ball and the lyrics at the bottom. And as a kid, I remember this is totally off topic, but I can't let this pass
Yeah.
because I've got this great image in my mind of Mitch Miller with his little goatee leading
Yeah,
this,
yeah.
and it was incredible. It was in the 60s, and it was still very popular when I was a kid. And I remember singing along to these guys in cardigan sweaters, and it was hilarious. So it's
So
unbelievable.
it's a fantastic, but so I love these connections too. Is
Yeah.
her father was a musician. She's a very fine photographer of both
Wonderful.
documentary and had done all these children's books. But she had sort of disappeared. I found this book and I thought, oh my gosh, I wonder, can I license the images? I go to the publisher, which is McGraw Hill, and they say, they have a form for licensing images, and they say it may take us with something something like up to 20 weeks to respond. I'm like,
Oh my
well,
gosh.
that's it. It's not going to happen. I found them too late. 3 days later, I get an email that says, hey, these rights have reverted to the photographer. We only had them for a few years. Here's her post office box address. So I dig around further. I'm like, well, I'll send her a letter. Because she was involved with the Mitch Miller Foundation, I was able to find a phone number for her, call her up and said, hey, I'm sorry to bother you. Do you remember this book you did? And she's like, that was 30 years ago. I'm like, you have these great pictures. Had a great chat with her, and she licensed the use of her photos, sent me all of her original negatives. I scanned all of them and sent them back so she has digital files, and used just a fraction in the book. And but what she did, I'm sorry, the reason I go on about this is she, for this author, she went to King Features, she went to United Press Syndicate, she went to Marvel and a few other places, and then went to the studios of John Cullen Murphy, yep, and Frank Romita, I think it was, right? And
John Romita?
John Romita, I'm sorry. And also somewhere got connected with Hank Ketchum. I thought he was living in Switzerland, but I don't know, maybe he had a studio or had some space still in America. Yeah, I thought he'd moved there by 93. But so there are photos. So she went to those 3 studios plus all these organizations, and she has pictures. Oh, and she went to, this is me getting so excited, to American Color, which was the company under a few different names that over 60 years produced most of the color, did most of the color work, and then printed most of the Sunday color for newspapers until papers started to adopt their own 4-color printing in-house. So she had pictures I hadn't seen anything this good anywhere. So you'll see several photos in the book that are credited to her in black and white, and they're just super sharp. And it shows these weird processes that nobody does anymore. And it's so exciting. And particularly inside American Color, which went out of business, or kind of merged out of business in the early 2000s. They'd already thrown away all their archives, apparently. Tim Baddock had tried to get some of his old color separations when Kent State started to republish his work. And they're like, oh, we threw that all away in 95. Like, we have no film left. And he's like, why didn't you call? They were going out of business. They were going out of business for many years because they were kept losing newspapers who were developing in-house work, the digital, etc. So it's just an invaluable historical record of which I've been able to reproduce just a portion of, but it was so exciting to find that. And to get the rights to use it.
It's fantastic. She must be in her 70s or 80s now, I'm sure.
Yeah, she's in her 70s, and she's just, and they travel, and they've got, it's just
and then all out of the blue.
It's a very small world. Yeah, she gets a call like, what the heck? So I'm hoping, what I'd love to do is, I'm talking to her about if she would want to do a small book that would just reproduce all the photos. Oh, wonderful. There's a great picture, and there's Jim O'Keefe, who does, used to do Flash Gordon, now does Sally Forth.
Right.
There's a picture in them as a child. I mean, he's, 20s. From when he worked at King Features, because he was an in-house colorist, and there's these pictures of him with luxurious hair and a youthful face. And so when I found those, I got permission from the photographer. I sent some photos I'd been in touch with Colin Murphy and with his sister Meg, who she did the lettering for. So when John Cullen Murphy took over Prince Valiant entirely, Cullen by then had already been writing the scripts with Hal Foster for a while. He took over script writing, and then Meg did the color guide work and the lettering for many years. Until her father stopped doing the strip, and it was passed on, and they went on to do other things. And so I sent a letter to Meg, or sent an email to Meg and to Cullen, and said, hey, this may be a blast from the past. Here's pictures of your dad. I got permission to send you these contact sheets. And then same thing, Jim O'Keefe. I'm like, hey, I recognize this guy. It turns out he had a photo from that. He has a photo on his website that's a photo from that photo session. So
that's fantastic.
Apparently, even when these things disappear from our knowledge, people do remember them, which is great.
Yeah, and it's interesting how all these roads intersected with one another. I mean, all through, several different people, but even this one photographer who is also descended from somebody of note. It's really surprising. It's fantastic. But so this was quite a journey for you. I mean, how many years really do you think you worked on this book?
Well, it's funny, like at one level is maybe a year and a half, and at another more like 7 or 8, because I didn't know I was working on it for as long as I was. I was doing a lot of string pulling. I in 2017, I connected with this program where I'd done some letterpress classes I'd taken the classes, and I'd done some letterpress printing in college. And I was trying to figure out how to get back into more creative work and get away from this, this freelance, the imploding freelance market, what already was happening. Mm-hmm. And my mentor there, who ran this letterpress program at a Seattle school, it's now spun off into its own nonprofit called Partners in Print, where they're trying to do socially positive work and do interesting work in bringing people from underserved communities and do it's interesting approach to letterpress to make it vibrant and current, and do remote. They've done remote classes all through the pandemic. They were doing Zoom classes in letterpress, which sounds implausible.
Yeah, right.
One group developed this one fellow developed a thing called the provisional press, which is a small build it yourself, just a simple press with almost like those old cash register kind of things you would pull over. So you could put type down and make it so you could buy a press during the pandemic and assemble a tiny one at home, which was amazing. And other people had access to it. But anyway, so these folks, they said, why don't you come be our designer in residence? And I went and printed a book in 2017 by hand, a bunch of things I'd written about type and language and printing. And as I was researching, I started finding flong and these other terms. I keep digging up and these things. And so I had started researching it, and I did not know to what end. I had no idea. Just everywhere I went, though, and everything I studied, people I talked to, they kept telling me about these aspects. I start reading. I start acquiring very cheap old books. If you want a book on commercial engraving from 1924, you can get it in like 3 days, and it costs you $10. It was probably $250 in its day, inflation adjusted.
But not only did you come across books from 1924 and things of that, but you also came across some really interesting material like the Little Peanuts comic that came from the Des Moines Register, right?
My gosh, that's incredible. I think I spotted it. Now to be totally fair, it was in Chip Kidd's book. It's a wonderful title. Let me see if I can find the title really quick. It's the one that he did, Only What's Necessary. Yeah, it's a lovely, interesting book about Charles M. Schulz and the Art of Peanuts. So Chip Kidd and Geoff Spear did that in, when was that? 2010 or something.
Oh, okay.
2015. Yeah. And so it's an interesting counterpart to the 100 Objects book that Nat Gertler and Gentler rather, and Benjamin Clark did. They're interesting counterparts because they're sort of different aspect of Schultz's career, but they're both kind of centered around more material objects as opposed to the strip itself, right, or the contents are reproducing it. And so Chip Kidd has a reproduction of this in there, and I lost my mind when I saw it. I thought, so to those who haven't seen this, you can find scans online that are pretty good. And it's in the 1950s, the Des Moines Register and Tribune, they had it was one company, had both newspapers, one was morning and one was evening. They would do tours like a lot of newspapers would. And when you got the tour, they would give you a little booklet. And the booklet was 16-page guide of Peanuts guiding you through the printing plant, and it's little weird off-brand or like off-model Charlie Brown and Lucy, and the cartoonist Bob Davenport was a buddy of Charles Schulz, and he said, "Hey, can I draw them? This is early in Schulz's career, and the Register was running it, or the Tribune or whatever was running Peanuts." And he's like, "Yeah," and I think that's one of the only times that Schulz ever allowed anyone else to draw his characters in strip form, right? It must be.
Well, of course, there was the comic book from Dell and whatnot.
Oh, right, but like in a right, and this is sort of weird, right? It's like newspapery versus, yeah. So it's a very strange thing, but it's super accurate. Like there's like one thing, and then so that's in there, and that and here's the funny part is the guy who edited my book, who I hired, since this is a freelance or a self-published project, Harry McCracken. He is obsessed with animation and old comics, and I knew this, but he's also a technology editor, and he had been my editor for 20 years at different publications when I'd written for him at PC World and Fast Company. He's a great guy. So I'm searching, I see this Chip Kidd thing, and I'm like, my God, did someone scan this? Can I use this? Who has the rights? There's no copyright notice in it. So by copyright law, ostensibly it's in the public domain, but I also wanted to make sure that the folks at the Peanuts Enterprises were comfortable with it because it's their trademark characters. Sure. So, right. So I dig around and I find a scan of it. Who has the scan? Harry McCracken. And I'm like, Harry, do you have the originals? He's like, oh no, I sold them a few years ago. So anyway, in the end, the Schultz Museum had scans, had super high resolution scans that they allowed me to use, and the Peanuts Worldwide and all the other folks involved let me reproduce it. But it's very exciting because it's so weird, but so useful.
Really weird. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to see Charlie Brown and Lucy mingling with an adult figure, which you never see in any other, configuration. I mean, I don't recall ever having seen that before. So that is a really odd, mix. I mean, really strange moment for anybody who's a Peanuts or Schultz fan of long standing to see an adult human being interacting with Peanuts characters is
Oh, it's
bizarre.
so funny. And then what's even better is a few years later, I run across, gosh, where is this? Maybe at the Billy Ireland, I think, or somewhere else. I run across this item. It's a similar guide, not but without the peanuts. It's a cartoon guide put out, I think, for maybe a National Cartoon Society meeting or something. But it's a shorter thing. I think it's 8 pages long, which is also reproduced in the book, and it's from the late 80s or maybe I think early 90s, and it's American color and what I think at the time was called the International Comic Art Museum or Museum of
Mhm.
Comic Art. It's Brian Walker and Mort Walker's
Right.
institution, and Brian has gave me so much of his time on this book. Like he was really, I've
Yeah, he's a
interviewed him
great
for
guy.
4 hours and answered questions and whatever. And so I got in touch with him. I said, do you remember this? And he said, I think that's when I wasn't working with them. It was like during some period he wasn't involved. Again, cannot find American Colors. Nobody left who cares about their
Wow.
copyright. It's their goal. I mean, I've tracked down the organization that ostensibly owns American Colors assets, and they don't even know they do, basically. And I try to track down the cartoonists, who both of whom I think are still alive, could not reach them. So I reproduced this in the book, small, but it's again another like a very contemporary look, a walk through the process. This time, very specifically, hey, you're a cartoonist. How are cartoons printed? Well, here's all the steps that happen. It's like a mini version of my book, but just for that period of time. So I was so excited to kind of not bookend, but to have the so I've got the popular science, popular mechanics, the Peanuts guide, and this American color guide, and those were like 4 waypoints that appear I was able to extract liberally from or reproduce entirely
Mhm.
that help tell the story from the angle of being told at the time people are reading about it, which I think historically, like we can interpret things, we're trying to recover things from the past, but when you can find accurate contemporary accounts, it's so great to say, here's what people were saying while this technology, while this artistry existed.
Yeah, yeah, that really does give you a view of history that makes it all that more tangible and something you can connect to. There are a
Yeah.
number of things that surprised me about the book.
Mm,
I mean, but I mean, first of all, I think the most for anybody who's coming at it who just imagines, comics start in a cartoonist's, studio, and then they just sort of magically appear in the newspaper or in comic books or wherever else. The process over the many years, over the last century or so that you've described, the process is inordinately complex. I mean,
oh
it's
my gosh.
unbelievable how many steps between the cartoonist drawing board and the printed material, which is fascinating, and the evolution of it is fascinating as well, because of course it goes hand in hand with the evolution of technology through the century. That was one thing. The other thing that struck me walking away from the book with like, the generalized impression was how many people were involved in that process
Mm.
and how many exceptionally well-trained people were working on the comic strips or whatever material it was, but comic strips in particular, um, we're working on it and sort of seeing the artist's vision, the cartoonist's vision through all the way so that it could be realized in a way that at least, was somewhat parallel to what they imagined it would be initially. And that
Oh
took an
yeah.
enormous number of people and an enormous amount of skill that's completely unsung.
This is kind of the subtext of my book, which you read fully. I mean, you're reading the subtext fully. Is the book is kind of a celebration of unsung labor, right?
Mhm.
Unknown people, unnamed people, whatever. There's a name in a story, and it says Bob so and so. I'm like, I'm going to get Bob so and so's name in there because you had people who were artists and I mean, they're all craftspeople. A lot of the newspaper process. I think people think, well, isn't this, sticking ink on paper? It's this big thing, but every aspect of it, particularly, I mean, I have this great experience. Is I'd worked on high school and college newspapers when we are kind of the offset era, like we're past metal. I never worked. I started in phototype setting and offset, so I never worked with metal presses until I was doing like bespoke hobbyist letterpress. And I've seen some of the big, there's still a few letterpresses that run. I did a book in 2020 that just sold out, a short edition letterpress book, and it was printed by a fellow I know in London who had met on a trip there. And he has a huge format Heidelberg automated press, and it's as automated as anything now. He keeps it great up to date. So you make plates differently. He set it in hot metal. He has a colleague up in the north of England who set it in hot metal. So there's still people doing that. But when he runs it, it requires a lot of crafts work, and letters can fall out and things like that. Yeah. But it's still, I got to see that in action and kind of contrast that. Like there's a lot fewer moving pieces when you move into offset. And then I went on press with a huge project in 2023, this 1,200 page 3-volume work on the history of keyboards that I was working with a client on. And I was edited it and supervised the production and logistics. And then I went on press to a printer that was in Maine, and I went and pressed with a printer in Canada for how comics were made. And I got to see the state of the art right now. Like, these are not giant, multi-billion-dollar press companies. These are family owned, but fairly like mid-size with the most modern gear that you would use for sheet-fed printing. And so I enjoy having seen that whole spread. And so even today, even with computers, like the folks in Canada, they have so many feedback systems, all these cameras inside the press, and they have these beautiful displays that are so matte, they look like paper, and their proofing system is all this laser liquid ink system that you proof on it so you can it's incredible, right? Even then, the amount of craft involved, like those guys, and unfortunately the presses are still mostly run by men. There's very few women still in the printing side of things. It's an old tradition, unfortunately. Those guys really are constantly monitoring, they know their press. It's a living creature. They're constantly working with it. It's a lot easier now than it was 20 years ago or 100 years ago, but it's truly a craft. And
it really is. I mean, and I was thinking that these are going to be words that the audience is not familiar with, but the Gamboge painters, the people.
Oh, yes.
Oh my gosh, those folks were, they must have been skilled painters and artists themselves, because they're literally, painting gray tones in, through the Ben-Day process. They're working on all of that, and it's got to be done in an artful way and a very artful way, because not only do you have to paint, but you have to have a sense of value. You have to know what's placed where, and then you had to, of course, balance or arrange the zipatone in such a way so the overlays didn't create that moire effect or whatever it's called.
Yeah, that's the thing. I'm most proud of the Ben-Day chapter, actually, because I feel like it was so much recovered history. I went through so many sources and dug so deeply to find like one image or one fact, because it's totally gone now. I don't think there's even any Ben-Day equipment left, but this was a process. So for listeners who have never heard of Ben-Day, or if you have and you've thought of it as, it's a dot process, like zipatone, like an adhesive thing or something you rub down. These were artists who painted on zinc. So they were given a color guide, and then they used the gamboge as this water soluble ink, and they had to paint perfect masks around each area that was going to get a different tint. And from what I can tell, and then they'd paint it, then they'd use these specialized screens that had dot patterns on them, and they would then burnish the ink from these screens onto the zinc plates. And each color, so you have four secondary colors, should say, reflective colors: cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, which are often called just CMYK, but they interestingly often called blue, red, cyan, or yellow and black in the old days, even though and I'm not sure. I think I think the comics may have actually veered towards more primary than the
Yeah.
process colors today. And
Mhm.
you can sort of tell as you look at old comics printed and new ones. But
Mhm.
so you have 4 plates for every comic, and so a cartoonist would mark something up. And I have all these actually there's a whole chapter on coloring peanuts that
Right.
reproduces color guides that were produced in Schultz's studio over 3 eras of specification, and was so pleased to be able to talk to Aaron, whose last name, of course, I'm forgetting while we're talking, was Schultz's last like colorist and
Mhm.
kind of studio assistant. Erin Samuels, I'm sorry, and
Mhm.
she had gave me some of her time, which was lovely, and feedback, and she talked because Charles, this is so close to you and so close to any cartoonist. Is Schultz exercised such control over the entire range of his process, except interestingly, he had other people apply Zipatone in that era as soon as that was available, and it goes back to the 50s,
Right.
and he probably did it in the 50s and maybe 60s, but at some point that becomes an assistant task, which is fascinating because but I think, and I make this case in the book, I feel like Schultz, especially studying originals, I feel like Schultz used or directed the adhesive Zipatone usage for grayscale and dailies particularly, almost as a like architectural element, like a shading element. I've rarely seen other cartoonists where there's slivers cut out or directions or overlaps. So he's using them as like a real shading thing, not a solid tone. Because usually a cartoonist would say, "I want 20% here," and someone would cut out a little thing and slap it down. There's 20%. But you look at like a mailbox on one of the cartoons I reproduce, and the mailbox has all of these arcs and shapes cut out and gaps. He's really almost trying to make it 3 dimensional,
Mm.
but because I know some of these were done by assistants, he is telling people do a thing like this, and he's
Yeah.
letting them do that little bit of artistic expression. And the same thing with the coloring, where Erin said that when she took over in the oh gosh, it's the 80s now. I'm losing track of her involvement. It was a little bit later. She said she used old color guides as an example to know what the colors he wanted on different characters were,
Mhm.
but often she would color something up and he'd look at it and go, "That's great." I mean, so for somebody who seemed to have such a tight grasp, like really controlled it, he really trusted people with a couple of these last aspects that I think of as integral to the strip, the coloring and the
Uh-huh.
shading, and he must have thought of as something he could trust other people to do under direction.
Yeah. It is interesting. It's kind of odd. To be frank, on a just personal taste, I've always found
Hmm.
the introduction of the gray tones in the dailies jarring. I always felt,
Hmm.
and I guess a lot of that comes from, I grew up with Peanuts in its classic period and whatnot, and so I'm used to Schultz's use of black and white and the minimal quality, which I always felt it just feels so natural to the strip, so organic.
Hmm.
And when I see the introduction of the Zipatone or whatever they're using later on, it just felt out of sync with the world Schultz had created. So I never felt comfortable with it. Although, that's not to disavow the use of Bende or Zipatone at all, because in the hands of somebody like Roy Crane,
Oh yeah.
he was brilliant with it. I mean, he used that what was the material that revealed the dot patterns on illustration board? I can't
Oh,
remember.
craft tint.
Craft tint, yeah, which you
Yeah,
talk
which is
about in the book also.
an amazing discovery to me. I mean, everybody, so many artists know about it, and they're like, "Oh, craft tint." They're like, "I almost died." There's people
Yeah,
are
well,
like, "Yeah, craft tint was terrible. It almost
Patrick
killed me."
McDonald.
Oh
Yeah.
my God.
The
Yeah.
story you tell about Patrick McDonald, who was found he was working with it early in his early days on Mutts, and he got sick and sicker, and they found out mercury was in the chemicals.
Yeah, and different people, it's interesting. Like everybody always complained. If you talk to every artist I talked to who mentioned Crafton, if you go online, you read all accounts of it, which I was doing, everybody always complained about the smell because it was full of all kinds of crud in there.
Oh
You
my
look at the
gosh, yeah.
ingredients list, it's not great. But I know that some people are more susceptible to certain kinds of chemicals. Some people have a formaldehyde susceptibility. Some people are, which we shouldn't have any arsenic, but like the smell of things or whatever. So whatever was in there, it certainly hit him. And the minute he stopped using craft tint, he felt better, thank goodness. But
Yeah.
we would have lost a great talent if that had
Oh my gosh.
knocked him out
Well,
just from the ink or
I'm just
the
wondering about
inks.
Roy Crane now, who I was actually surprised you didn't mention Roy Crane, but we'll get back to
Mm,
him second. But speaking of Roy Crane, I don't know if he smoked or not, but he certainly worked during the period when people were heavy smokers.
Oh my
And he's
gosh,
got
yeah.
this stuff going on, and he worked with that stuff for years. And I
Yeah.
can't imagine what kind of impact it had on his health.
I hate to see his lungs. Yeah, well, tell me about Roy Crane because I know his work, but there's a survivorship bias in the book, which is I was working from materials that people had collected. So you'll notice like the big four, I would say, I mean, these are four of the most popular strips of all time, but it's
Yeah.
it's Peanuts, Doonesbury, For Better For Worse, and Calvin and Hobbes. And it's, and as you go through it, you're like, well, Peanuts, Schultz has his own library. Doonesbury, Gary Trudeau has given everything, he kept everything, and he gave it all to Yale. So I was able
Oh,
to
that's
take a trip
great.
to the Yale Beinecke Library. They just pulled stuff out for me with his permission.
Wonderful.
And For Better For Worse, Lynn is who is also just a total rock in this. Like she talked to me for hours, she's answered so much email, gave me so much permission to to reproduce stuff. She donated all of her originals to Archives Canada. And the Billy Ireland also has a bunch of printing materials and other stuff from her. And then Bill
Wonderful.
Watterson, the Bill Watterson, I think it's called the Deposit Collection at the Billy Ireland, has all of his originals and a lot of other material too. And he gave permission I was able to ask them, and he gave permission so I could reproduce both original art and reproduced art in the book. And so the survivorship thing is like, well, those are the big ones, right? I have a chapter in Doonesbury. We got a chapter that makes
Yes.
extensive use of For Better For Worse, a chapter on Peanuts and throughout. And then you start going, all right, well, what else is out there? So
Mhm.
Roy Crane, like I don't think I found anything of his in anything I looked at, like originals or intermediate stages, and that
Mhm.
and that becomes it feels a little, it's not a failing on my part, but it is
No.
tricky. Or like Mike Peters, who I really wanted to put some of his stuff in the book, could not nail him down for permission. And the Billy
Oh,
Ireland has all his stuff. I was able to look at it. I took pictures. They'd be ready to scan it. And I just could not. I made a lot of contact efforts. And, I know the guy's in his 80s and he's got his own life going and he may not care. I mean, it's not a criticism of him. This is all me asking, begging for
sure.
permission. And so many people were great about it. And a few people I had old emails for. And later, Jan Elliott, do you remember
Yes, of course.
Stone
Stone
Soup?
soup.
So
Yeah.
I grew up in Eugene, Oregon. That's where Jan lives. And my
Great lady.
dad worked
Yeah.
with her at an early weekly paper when she was doing early strip. They worked together doing display advertising
Okay.
at Patience and Shara. Could not track her down. My dad and I are both trying to find her. And it turns out old email and nobody had the new one. And I get an email from out of the blue like, hey, were you trying to reach me? Like after the book is printed, I'm like, oh no, Jan.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm hoping
You should have
people
reached
as the
out
book,
because I
oh,
did an interview with her several years
oh,
ago now, and she was kind enough to send me an
dang.
original, which is real, which I'm is a treasured possession. But anyway,
Oh,
she's
that's
great,
lovely. I
nice
so I
lady.
didn't I have a bunch of stuff I've now gotten permission from her in advance. So if the book does well enough, and I'll talk about the future publishing of it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
If there's a second edition, I now have permission in advance, and the scans already from Billy Ireland. I've got it already. I can stick in a couple pages of Jan Elliott in, which would please me
Yeah,
no end.
that's
But
great. That's
but
great.
Roy Crane, tell me more about because I've seen his examples at like Legion of Andy at a Guy Lawley's site where he is such an expert on Ben Day and on craft tint.
Uh-huh.
But I didn't encounter much of his work.
Well, he did two strips that are classic. You mentioned one earlier, although I think you might have been thinking of a different one.
Oh,
Wash Tubs with Captain
mm,
Easy. And so it went by two names, Wash Tubs and first Wash Tubs, and then Wash Tubs and Captain Easy. And then on Sundays it ran as Captain Easy. And
okay.
and then of course he did Buzz Sawyer for many, many years
Yes,
after
yes,
Captain
okay.
Easy. And it's in Buzz Sawyer where you see the greatest flowering of his ability with the Ben-Day patterns and working with Crafton. And he was a master at it. And the layering and the texturing is absolutely gorgeous. I mean, nobody working in daily comics at that period of time applied gray tones to the extent or the quality with the skill that Roy Crane did. I mean, he's absolutely brilliant stuff. He was a great draftsman. He was a great storyteller. He was really, really in terms of lighthearted adventure. Wash Tubbs and Captain Easy really set. the table,
Mm-hmm.
for a lot that followed, whether we're talking about, something as far afield, say, as Flash Gordon, or we're talking about
Right.
Superman, which is based on Captain Easy in large part. Joe Shuster's whole style comes right out of Roy Crane. And if you talk to any of that generation of great comic book artists, they all point to Roy Crane as one of their idols because he was
Yeah.
archetypal, really.
Well, this is
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, this is one of the questions I have about him that I certainly couldn't find an answer to, and I have about a lot of artists. Is I want to know the like this came up with Winsor McCay, who I was able to reproduce a strip that has the best note in the world on it. So it's his original comic is has a note to the engraver because we
Oh,
think about when you think about Winsor McCay, you think about the incredible color palette he
oh,
used,
oh my
and
God.
so his on his original he notes, Mr. Hunt, this is a snow forest. All the trees and foliage are snow. Plenty of purple and blue tones. The only bright color will be in the costume of the figures and an orange sky. The rest all pale blue, pinks, and purple, cream-colored bears with cold blue shadows. M signed MC, and Mr. Hunt was Alfred B. Hunt was an engraver. And so what we think of as Winsor McCay's coloring,
Yeah.
I don't think McCay even delivered a color chart or color guide. Like I think later he did, but with Little Nemo, he just had Mr. Hunt, and Mr. Hunt realized his vision, and McCay, given the production time, probably didn't see the color. Like there was never a proof stage, unless he might have come in and looked and they talked. But as you say, Mr. Hunt, Alfred Hunt's working on or zinc plates. He's painting, he's removing stuff. They couldn't really proof them until they were re-etched for the final stage. So he's working in his head.
Right.
McKay might be able to come in and visualize, but you still wouldn't know. So it's this incredible like dance of cartoonist and engraver. So I wonder with Roy Crane, it's not to denigrate anything he did, but I'm thinking, so did he have a very close relationship? Did he work in black? So when you see originals, is if on his dailies, and I've seen this in somewhere, and some of the black originals have non-reproducing blue
Yeah,
tone on them to
sure.
indicate, and others have zipatone or other kinds of patterns applied to them before any engraving stage. So
Right.
that's one of the, I'd love to tease that again. I hope I get a second edition because I want to tease out more where the line between the cartoonist and the engraver, like what that, or
Yes.
even a studio assistant, where does that divide? So
Yes.
does it turn out, does Roy Crane, was he a great art director? Was he, I mean, terrific artist, right? Was he a great art director of the tones he wanted, or was he creating all the tones in the studio?
Well, I think he was creating him in the studio. If Craft
Mm.
enables you to do that, then
Oh,
that's
right,
what he
because he
was
was working with
doing.
craft tint.
He's
Right,
working
yeah.
with Crafton, yeah. So he was very much in charge of how it would look in the end. I mean, obviously, he still needs an engraver to see it through to the end, but
Oh no,
yeah,
you're, of course you're right. I've got a good example. I don't even know the artist. I have one piece of original art on craft tint where the person uses the two, like it's a duo tint, so there's two embedded tints and does some other kinds of hand stuff. And then you'll see stuff like Draper Hill. I reproduced some Draper Hill in there. I was able to get in touch with one of his kids, and they gave me permission to reproduce because
mhm.
Draper was an editorial cartoonist for
Oh yes,
decades, right? And it's funny, he's sort of forgotten now. I think it's just kind of missed the internet part. Like he passed away, stopped working. So, but his work's really fascinating. Extensive user of craft tin and a
hmm
really like an amazing I reproduced a good example, but some he'll have two or three of his own textures plus two craft tint textures, and I'm just thinking the amount of time you'd invest in it. But editorial cartoonists, I think in particular, benefited from craft tint and zip tone if they used it because they had such short turnaround times. Like
yeah.
cartoonists could hand something off. There was a 5 or 9 week cycle and whatever, right? I mean, I never worked up to the deadlines and all that, but they had a little more. They didn't have to deliver it. I've drawn it. It has to go out. I found Mike Peters. One of the things I want to reproduce of him is there's a stack of faxes in his papers. And I realized he's faxing from wherever he lived to whatever DC paper he was doing editorial cartoons for at the time. I think now he's out of the Dayton paper as
Uh-huh.
is a syndicate. But he would fax oversize, draw oversize, fax at fine setting, and they would just shrink that down. Like he wasn't even couriering stuff over
They just
because
take the facts.
I am pretty sure, but that's the
Wow.
thing is I want to confirm that more because the faxes, when you look at them, they are probably 200%. So he may have drawn at some size, enlarged, and then faxed the enlarged size, or he was drawing at an enlarged size, which takes a lot more time. So maybe not, I don't know. But at the fine setting, you reduce it enough and it's all black. You make sure somebody at the other end is probably taking a marker to color in the blackest areas, and then you'd shoot it on a stat camera, and all the blacks become black and all the lines are lines. And I think that's what's going on. And I think a couple people used to do this, but just for editorial cartoonists.
Talk about total disregard for the original or the art object, right? No regard for it whatsoever. It's a piece of crap. Just fax it over there, and they can do what they want with it. I mean,
Exactly.
oh my God, it's like, I mean, I come from a different, I went from cartooning to fine art back to cartooning again. So I have deeply embedded in me a reverence for that original object.
Yes.
And I can't imagine being so cavalier with it. And also, the other thing that drives me crazy is with my own work. I'm a control freak. I mean, right,
Hmm.
and I know a lot of people are. I mean, we've learned to be, because in this contemporary era, we have much more control over what our final product's going to look like. And yet I can't imagine handing it over to somebody, to
Yeah.
enable, like, somebody who's one of those Gamboge painters or whatever, to do all of this work that really is, it's a good chunk of, it's like 25-30% of your final product is from those guys.
But there was, I mean, that's the thing, is there was no choice, right? That's
Yeah,
why that happened. Is like, it's a very interesting. I mean, I try to make some of the economic argument in the book. I try to not make it
yes.
all about. But you've seen there's numbers throughout. There's
Yeah,
some
yeah,
numbers.
sure.
But I think economically, when I did my interviews for the book, I've thought about launching a podcast that's like the act inside the actor studio
Yeah, oh, I love
podcast.
that idea. Yeah.
And because I would ask everybody, I finally got it down to three questions I would start with: is how do you think of a line? How do you conceptualize color in your work? And did seeing reproductions of your work affect how you produced it? And
Oh,
I got great answers from all that, because that's kind of the fundamental question I'm asking from a reproduction side. And I think when you look back historically, like the McKays and the folks who did uh, early comics like Yellow Kid and even ones before that, they were all about line. They're making a line really fast, right?
yeah.
And because a line can be reproduced really well through zinc engraving in that day. That's all they needed. But color was money, right? The minute they added color, they could sell more papers.
Mhm.
And there was huge profit margin. They started selling massive amounts. So did the cartoonists, like their integral relationship with color is kind of almost like the newspaper publisher wants it, cartoonists wanted it, I'm sure, then too. But the economics of it meant the publisher would pay. I mean, I've read, and I would still love to nail down these numbers better. It could take a week for an engraver, maybe even two engravers a week, to do something like a Tarzan or those full pages, or Hal Foster's Prince Valiant,
Yeah.
because the detail, and when you think about it, you're like, and you think about the Gamboge, and they're working on a sheet that's what is it, like 22 inches by 27 inches. They have four zinc plates that big, and they're painting across the whole thing all this detail. And you look at the color guides, and the color guides have a million
Yes.
colors on them.
Oh my
And
gosh.
the newspaper is absorbing all that, right? The newspaper publisher or the syndicate. So it's not like they're giving anything to the cartoonist. Let's, God forbid, they're
Yeah,
giving anything to the cartoonist. But like, that's the industrial operation. So the cartoonist is like this art operation. They do this extent, and then this huge industrial machine. You hear the bump, 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 bump
yeah,
sound
yeah,
going in
yeah.
the background as all of these craftspeople involved. This whole what seems like an incredibly expensive operation, which was. They had so many hundreds of people at any average newspaper involved in this, or syndicate for color stuff. But the margins, the price, or the profit margins, and the absolute cash they brought in was so huge, they just absorbed it. So
Yeah.
anyway, I guess my argument is a little bit like, is at that point, nobody had a choice, but it also made so much money. Cartoonists were making the equivalent of millions. I mean, some of the best ones, millions of dollars a year.
Yeah.
Bud Fisher or Rube Goldberg or somebody.
Million.
I mean, yeah, I can't, a Kniff. And I mean, you're like, when I started to do the inflation calculations, and like, well, what is $50,000 a year in 1932 today? You're like, oh my goodness, like they were.
Yeah.
This
Couple
isn't just
million
like,
bucks.
this is Garfield money, right? Garfield money for seemingly maybe a few dozen people at the peak, and a lot other people making less. but probably what we consider a good middle class living today,
Oh,
like pay the
absolutely.
bills, have health care, and nothing like that today for most people. I understand, but it is anyway. I think color and this industrial operation actually drove the profit that let cartoonists make those sums of money in those days. And then as the process has collapsed, kind of like because things have gotten better, now the cartoonist has more and more responsibility, more and more control, right? You get to control. It's only when you get digital color do
Yep.
you as an artist, right, get to control what the color is actually going to look like
Right.
on your strips. So the first time in history, and yet it's also now your responsibility, and it's in your contracts typically that you have to pay, you have to make the color, provide it. Jim O'Keefe joked with me, I included it in the book. He said his contract for Sally Forth, he does not have to provide final color, and he will for some special Sundays and things like that. He only has to provide a color guide, and he's been numbering guides for 35 years
Yeah.
or longer. So he just sits down there and goes,
He
and
knows what he's,
they're, and they're not paying him for that. So, and he's contracting. Someone like Tahid Bandia, I talked to him, and like color is such an integral part of his process. But his contract, he also, I believe, I don't know all the details, I think he has to provide the final color, but it's also how he wants to work, right?
Oh yeah,
So
sure.
anyway,
Yeah, I understand that completely. I would be the same. Color is an integral part of it. It's a part of the
hmm
storytelling. And I think maybe that's a, a later day conception that cartoonists have, that their color is also part of the storytelling process.
Mm,
It works emotionally, psychologically to help tell the story. But
yeah.
I'm thinking back now to a couple things that we just sort of passed by really quickly. Just one thing I was thinking, you're talking about Outcall, you're talking about Winsor McCay, you're talking about line, and it struck me, thinking about the process and thinking about going from the zinc plate or whatever to I can't remember the exact process because it's so detailed
It's
and I've
so
only
many,
read the
there's
book
so
once.
many steps in it. Oh my
Right.
goodness.
So, but when you get the flong and you get that, and the flong is out of paper, and that's taking an imprint from this plate, right? This metal plate.
Right. Yeah.
And what I'm amazed at is that because so many cartoonists, you know, work with really fine line, really beautiful line quality. And sometimes it's relatively clean and simple. Sometimes, though, you're dealing with a cartoonist like George Harriman or somebody who's working in a more a style that is more expressive, that's not so clean, where maybe there's a lot of cross hatching. So it's amazing to me that these materials could pick up the fine quality that's in the line, so that in the reproductions,
Oh
um,
yeah.
we can see it. Going back, you can still see as rough as newsprint was and all that. You can still see that the quality of line work. It's really remarkable that they were
Yeah.
able to pick this up.
It's astonishing when there's 7 generations involved too.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
the fact that it can go, I'll walk it through because this is something I actually have to, I'm glad I wrote my book because I can now refer to my book so I don't have to keep it all in my head. But it's, so, artist drew it original, then there's a photographic negative, then they make a zinc plate from that using etching, then they make a flong for that for distribution, then the newspaper casts a plate for layout, then the newspaper makes a flong of the entire page, including that, then they make a plate from that. And you think, how did any detail
yeah,
survive, right?
exactly.
But then I'll look at the flong, or I have some newspaper full page comics flongs that were like or comics page flongs too. So I can see, I have nearly every stage of the process in my personal collection. And so that last stage, or I can look under a loop at like the stereotype plate I have, the newspaper plate of a comic, and the halftone dots are still there. You can still see the dots. You can see the fine lines, and things bloat, right? Things bloat and stretch and so forth. So if you compare the original artwork, I mean, this is something, again, that 288 page book. It's next edition, I might try to do more of that. Is like, I'd love to see, I couldn't find one comic that went through the entire process where I had the original, because I have a few zincs. I've got a Wizard of Oz zinc and a
You mean a Wizard of
Joe.
Id?
Oh, sorry, Wizard of Id's. Yeah, sorry, Wizard of
Id.
Id's zinc plate and a few other zinc plates, but I don't have the original art for those or the later the later flongs and so forth. But I'd love to be able to trace, like, here's what the artist drew, and then in each stage, and then here's what the newspaper reproduction was, put them side by side. And I think actually in How to Read Nancy, they do that. They show original artwork and the final thing in some of their reading pages, so you can see how, washed out or blurry or whatever, but the detail is still, it's an extraordinary amount of preservation for, it's like they're beating it with a stick,
Yeah.
right? You're just like over and over.
How does anything survive all of that?
Yeah.
It's amazing because they're going, as you said, through all of these different stages, and we all know that what happens to when you make duplicates of, even just a file, right?
Yeah.
There's degradation all along the way with every iteration. So that just blows my mind, and especially when you're looking at something like Winsor McCay and the beauty in his line work, which is, sometimes so fragile and so thin, that the nuances of those lines were carried through all the way. It's just brilliant.
Well, I'll give you a tiny bit of even further printing histories. I've got a chapter of a book that's going to, I contributed one chapter to an academic book that's coming out from Oxford University Press, hopefully this year, that I contributed the flong and stereotype chapter, surprisingly.
Okay.
But the book is called Printing Things, and it's about the materials of printing from 1400 to 1900. And the people involved are all academics. I'm so privileged because I'm the flong guy. Like, nobody has focused as much on this as I have. So though I have a mentor at University of London who's an early book person. She's like, you should contribute a chapter. I'm like, will you walk me through how to write in an academic format? Because I don't know. And she did, and they've been great. So I have a 7,500 word chapter with 113 footnotes or something. Mm-hmm. But for that, I dug very deeply, and I've touched with my own hands some of the earliest examples of like the technology even from the early 1800s, stuff I didn't even know survived. I was in London and happened to coincide with a blog post that went up from the Stationers Company of London, which is the organization used to have to get a license from the Stationers Company to publish in England. And I think it was founded in the 1400s. So I met the archivist at their new building, which is from the late 1600s after the Great Fire of London. And she's like, well, we have this, and it's this example from 1805. It's the first plaster mold from Lord Stanhope, the third Earl of Stanhope. And he developed not only the iron hand press, which was a huge innovation in printing in the early 1800s and did not patent it, he also developed this stereotype process using plaster molds to cast metal plates, which people have been working on for hundreds of years. But the thing at that time, of course, is preserving the fine serifs of the type. Mm-hmm. And so even in this early 1805 example in plaster, you're looking at the detail like, oh, they managed to figure this out because they needed to get a kind of a amorphous mix. The plaster materials had to be able to hold the detail and maintain rigidity when you're pouring metal in and heating it. So as it progresses and they move from plaster to these paper thing, like as paper mashed paper, it's not exactly papier mâché, but it's a glue and paper process, which is called wet flong. It's again all about the detail. And then by the time you hit the syndication era of the early 1900s and newspapers are syndicating, comics start to become syndicated heavily in the 1910s, it's because there's been this breakthrough with dry flong, which is a wood pulp amalgam. So it's mostly paper and wood products, but it has no like direction or grain or texture to it, and yet it holds together and it holds any form you press into it. And so I don't know, have you ever encountered electrotyping? This gets a little far afield, but
I've heard the term, and I think you mentioned it in the book, but I don't really know much anything about it at all.
I won't go into great depth, but if somebody listening is curious how beautiful this can be, electrotyping was a electrochemical process of producing reproductions, typically of wood engravings. If you search on Tenniel electrotypes, you will find amazing photographs because the original Tenniel illustrations of Alice in Wonderland. I keep saying Wizard of Oz. Alice in Wonderland. Those survived, and they must have been held privately. Whatever. They went up for auction a few years ago, and the auction house posted a zillion high-resolution photos. Oh, wow. And so an electrotype is a fascinating creature of the 1800s. It was 3D printing, basically. In 1830, you would make a wax mold of something, put graphite filings on top of it, you would brush them on, and then put the whole thing into a tank full of dissolved copper and sulfuric acid. You'd attach a cable to a battery, which then was like some kind of galvanic pile or something, and you'd attach one to the wax mold, and the copper over many hours would migrate to the graphite base, and then you would pull out a shell that was an exact copy. So they used this to copy artworks in museums, and there was this whole effort in the 1830s and 1850s. And I saw an exhibition at the Seattle Art Museum a few years ago where it was a pre-Raphaelite exhibition, and they were showing part of it was like, oh yeah, and you could, museums around the world would make electrotyped duplicates of their artwork because it was very minimally invasive. You were making a wax mold of the original. So in printing, what happened is there was this transition. Thomas Buick discovered a way to use a hard end grain of wood to use the same etching tools that were used in fine art etching. Instead of using like wood gouging tools, you can now etch as if you were etching on copper, but without any chemical process required. So suddenly in the 1800s, you go from a very small amount of illustration to a massive amount, and it sells papers, right? So you have this glorious, efflorescence of wood engraving and these huge papers, and the London Illustrated and the Graphic in London both start up, and Harper's Weekly, and they've massive, huge illustrations that they would break the blocks up, and they'd have multiple craftspeople working on simultaneously etching engraving the work created by a master artist, and hundreds of artists were involved in this. So the way those are reproduced for newspapers, the way this became feasible is electrotyping. You could push the wax deeply into these etched or these engraved wood surfaces, pull them off, God knows how without ruining the thing, and then produce metal printing plates. So Flong was the kind of next generation that coexisted, but they needed, the newspaper publishers wanted something with the kind of detail you could get from electrotyping, but with the simplicity and cost and ease of the paper of the Flong process. And anyway, that's how we get cartoons, basically. Like, without the development, I think, of this process that allowed cheap syndication and multi-generation reproduction of fine detail, I don't think we would have had anything like the rich cartoon culture in the early 1900s, because every cartoon would be produced for like one or two newspapers instead of being able to be distributed to hundreds and then thousands.
Well, it's incredible.
There we go. That's my thesis.
Well, no, I think it's, and I think it's fascinating. So then the Flong is produced, and when we're talking about the original Flong, it's flat. And
Right.
by the time the newspapers are really proliferating in the 20th century, they've got to be curved.
Right.
So then the Flong is curved, and then a mold is taken of that.
Yeah, there are these amazing casting machines where they would put sometimes the Flong, I've seen things that are like humidors, basically. They would put the Flong in this thing, and they'd pull down, and it would release a little bit of moisture and press it into a half cylinder shape. And in other cases, they would just take the Flong out of the press, like this. It would go through this almost squeezy, like a lithographic or like a clothes ring kind of press, and they just bend it by hand and stick it into this mold. They pull a lever, and 40 pounds of molten lead come into the thing, and they pull it back, and lead sets almost, it's also, I should say, it sets very quickly at room temperature. It's also water jets are pushing in from behind. So they pull it in, the lead goes in, it hits the Flong, the water rushes in behind, they pull the lever back, and they pull out a plate that's cold to the touch, basically. And then they clean it up a little bit, and they put it on a conveyor belt, which takes it from the Flong and stereotyping room down to the press. And so you can see these great pictures or video of like a stream of half-cylinder plates just going down through the corridors to where they need to be.
Oh my gosh. It's overwhelming really to think about. We tend to think of ourselves as so sophisticated and technologically advanced, but when you think of the ingenuity that had to go into the development of this extraordinary process, it's mind-blowing, because how did anybody ever think of electrotyping and dragging copper into, it blows my mind. It's just
here's the thing that gets me. I think I mentioned this in the book, is the guy who was the head of advertising standards at the New York Times. He wrote an amazing book and he taught classes to advertisers on how to prepare their material to be reproduced as ads. So he wrote this book called Advertising Production in the 1940s. That is the most beautiful snapshot of every single thing you need to know about how things were printed by newspapers. It is a Bible, and thank God that he did this because there's nothing quite like it. And in it, he's talking about a lot of New York Times examples, includes some photos, and he says you can take. So here's what we can do with the Times. It from the linotype slugs coming off, like we need to put new material on the front page, right? For another edition. The linotype slugs, which only takes a few minutes for someone to set, right? Because they're working, and stuff's coming, the slugs are set. They put that on the layout, they put that on the stone where they put the pages to be laid out. They drop the new slugs in, someone proves it. From that moment where it's in a page, it goes, it's 15 minutes from there down to the stereotype room to be made into flong and a plate. So 15 minutes to get a plate, 15 minutes from that plate to Times Square. In that next 15 minutes, they get it on press, they print copies, they bind them, they fold them, they put them on a truck, and they drive them a few blocks and drop them off at the train station.
15,
So 30 minutes from a new page composition in metal to newspapers literally in people's hands.
That is astonishing.
And you're like, this is 1944 or 42.
Oh my gosh, that's
Yeah.
incredible. I mean, I had no idea. When reading the book, I got the feeling that the process it is so involved. There's so many people working on it, and there's so many steps, and all you can think of as you're reading is that, well, this must just, how did they ever get a newspaper out in a day?
Oh my gosh. Well, some things took a week, right? Like coloring the pages,
Yeah.
and doing all the zinc and the etching and so forth. And then other things like resetting the copy and making the flongs was just this. I mean, it was such I mentioned a couple times in the book, I use this phrase like the perfection or the apotheosis of the mechanical process, because they had it down to such a perfect art, and it was all incredibly specialized labor. Like most people didn't, it wasn't like a assembly line, but people had very specific jobs that they might do a range of things in like photography, but like there's one person who's like, he's the guy who does all the zinc etching in this shift, and they have, and he's the best person at it. Or maybe there's 5 people doing it, but you might need that. So hey, a new photo came in. Did you know they had fax machines in the 1920s?
No.
What? They could do radio transmission of images. I wish I were making this up. I was watching a Jimmy Stewart movie several years ago, and it's like Call Klondike 5 something or whatever. It's this movie about someone wrongly convicted. He's about to be put to death, and or something like that. I'm sorry, it's a parole hearing. It's not as bad as he's about to be put to death. Jimmy Stewart is an intrepid reporter. He gets new information. The parole board's meeting, and they're trying to get an enlargement of a photograph sent to the parole board before the guy's opportunity is closed off. And they show somebody go into a room and start faxing a photo, and it's like 19. And I'm like, what is going on here? I've lost my mind. So they had developed essentially an audio scanning mechanism. It was very slow, but it was a wire service. In some places they had dedicated lines. In other places they could literally call up a phone and you could fax an image from one place to another. And that's how the AP wire photos started.
Okay. Oh, okay.
So
yeah.
somebody could be at an event. They could fax a photo from a newsroom in the city they're at. It would come into a newspaper. The newspaper could take that. They could run it through the process and get zinc plate, photographs, zinc, etched, and just, it takes some time, and maybe it's 30 minutes. Then they run it onto the front page. And so maybe it's an hour. They could have a photo from a distant city at Times Square. And you still think, it seems like, well, this feels like blogging speed practically, not metal production speed. So some things were very slow and very ponderous. They had schedules, and other times they could turn news around on a dime.
That's amazing. And you think about famous photographs of the period, and obviously, yeah, I mean, now that you mention it, I do recall, they were able to transfer photographs via radio waves.
Isn't that wild?
It is wild,
Yeah.
but we do, unless somebody like yourself brings it back up, you lose track of that. Yeah, how else did that photograph of the Hindenburg go from
All over the world, right?
all over the world, right?
Yeah.
Or other famous photographs of the era. So yeah, it's amazing. We do lose sight of that. The history of technology and the history of the print medium and the news media is a fascinating one. And it's so great that this book, I mean, in a podcast we can only give a certain amount of a
Appreciate it, though.
glimpse into it,
Yeah.
though, because it's so rich. And and this book is so good that it's been picked up, right, by Andrews McMeel to be printed. Uh,
I'm so excited about this.
yeah, so tell us
It's
about
so
that.
great. I mean, because I thought, well, as talked at the outset, like I thought this was maybe too niche for anyone to be interested. Then I got this. The Kickstarter was overwhelming. I'm like, great. Now I'm going to do a book. I'm going to sell X thousand copies. Maybe there'll be 2,500. I don't know something. I think I think sold 1,700 in the Kickstarter. So I'm like, I'll print a modest amount. But I thought this is probably it. Like I've probably found the addressable audience, and I'm really happy, and that's great. And this is out there, and then whatever. Andrews McMeel got in touch with me. Because they were like, you're supporting the newspaper, writing about the history of newspaper comics. There aren't a lot of people doing that. Like, they literally said, what could we do to help? And I said, oh my God, really? And so in the end, we had a lot of conversation. They helped me in terms of like just streamlining the rights, because there's so many different Andrews McMeel and Universal Press and United Features that's in here. So they were great in just helping me arrange that for, because, I dealt with all the other syndicates here and there, but most of the material that survives, they represent most of the artists for the material that survived. So that was great. And then we spent some time talking about what a book would look like, and they were great about the whole thing. So they're doing a hardcover edition. So mine is soft cover. It's fancy in a few ways. I did a few fancy things. It's a very thick paper.
Beautiful stuff there.
I used I mean, at some point they were like, do you want to use 80-pound or 100-pound? I was talking to the printer. I'm like, it did really well. Let's go with make it a little thicker, a little more robust. So the Andrews McMeel version will be a standard trade edition. It's going to look great. It's going to be a hardcover. And the nice part is it'll be in bookstores June 2025. Practically identical interior. The cover will be a little different, but it's going to be in bookstores. And the other part is it's so hard to ship stuff. I don't know if you get people who are like, Geoff, could you ship this to me? I'm living, the UK or whatever, Germany. I'd like an original of yours. And you're like, that's great. Well, the original is X dollars and it's $500.
You're right, for shipping. I know, it's ridiculous.
Yeah. So to ship this book to Europe, I have to charge $50 for a $65 book. Yeah. So not only Andrews McMeel, because of the scale they're doing and the making a mainstream book, it's going to be cheaper, which is great. So it'll have a $40 list price, which I'm very excited about. I mean, it's funny because the Kickstarter helped me pay off all the costs. So I've done all the expensing of the book, and all the people who were part of that, this book wouldn't have happened without the Kickstarter. Having had happened, now I get the advantage that other people can have access to it at a more affordable price, and I don't have to warehouse the book and deal with it. So it's just very exciting.
The audience has been, has the satisfaction of knowing that they've helped this great history,
oh my gosh,
reach a lot of people, and a lot of people who are going to be very interested, to read it. Many more people than could have gotten it through the Kickstarter, and that's really so gratifying. It must be really gratifying.
It is, and there's people all over the world. I mean, I don't have like 1,000 people who said, I wish I could buy your book, but the shipping's too expensive. But I've definitely have many dozens of email people like, will this be distributed in Germany or England, whatever? I'm like, I don't know. And I talk, it's just as a publisher of one book, I have a few books, but only one active, printed book right now. It's impossible to get into real distribution. So it's, once it was announced, I think it went out in the catalog listings in late November, early December. Suddenly I'm just looking like, well, where is it listed? Like there it is at amazon.co.uk and Waterstones and at chapters.ca in Canada, or Indigo rather, in Canada, and all these bookstores in other countries. I'm like, well, what are they going to sell it for? And it's all $40 through, so if you want to, you can go into Waterstones and order it, and it's, 31 pounds in England and no shipping. I'm like, hallelujah. I love that everyone believed in it, and those who are early adopters have such a hand in having made it possible, but they get, I hope, what is a joy, even though, they paid more than later additional costs, like they have the joy of, it wouldn't have existed without you, and now you're making it possible for it to reach, even classrooms, like at $65 a piece, people aren't going to buy it for classrooms, but with wholesale discounts,
you'd be surprised.
I don't, but
textbooks cost a fortune anymore. So.
It's true, but that's why I'm still so glad that they can get it for a fraction with academic pricing if they want to get several copies for a classroom. So
well, I'm sure that institutions will be buying it for their libraries too. I mean, I just think it's such an essential history, and and a missing piece of the history. And I'm sure that if Andrews McMeel hadn't picked it up, I'm sure there were other publishers who were waiting, because they're, you think about Fantagraphics and what they do and their interest in the history of comics and what they've done for comic strips and preserving comic strips.
No,
They're
it's
one of the, many who'd be interested, I'm sure.
I want to call them out as I talked to them a little bit about it and they thought it was a little obscure, which I agreed, although after the Kickstarter it was a little different, but I want to call them out for Eric Reynolds there has
Mm.
just again like several other people, he's been just unstinting with his time. I'll just call him up or send him email and he just gave me so much insight, but there's a piece in here you may have seen. It's one of my favorite things in the book just about because it's so rare. It's a it's a ruby lith
Oh,
separation
I
in
love
FX
that.
book.
Yes.
Yeah, of a cover of Love and
Love and
Rockets. So
Rockets.
it's
I love it. Yeah.
I get to have Love and Rockets in the book, which is amazing. I know it's not a comic strip, but it's one of the best things
Oh,
ever
cool.
made.
Yeah, yeah,
Right?
it's
Yeah,
great.
exactly. But B, I can't even remember where I put it. It's so, but it's a. Oh yes, right. So what it is I asked Eric. I said, "Do you have?" Because I was trying to find. So again, listeners who aren't from our era, the when you're doing color separations in the post metal era and in the pre-digital era, you would cut like the color
Oh,
separator would have one sheet of acetate for every tint, like 10% yellow or
yeah.
40% magenta, and then they would trace. Again, it's an artistry. They would trace and cut this opaque material called rubylith. You could see through it, but in a camera, it photographed at 100% black, and you would cut it out into these shapes to cover. So you'd have a color guide. And so I got this amazing thing. I asked all around. Nobody had one that was substantial. Like I found few with a few what are called flips. Like you'd flip it open in different directions. It'd all be taped for to be photographed in position with registration marks. And but nobody had an elaborate one. And then Eric said, "Hey, I was digging around and I found two examples, and one is all warped, but one is this." And I'm like, "Will you lend it to me?" He said, "Sure, I trust you." I'm like, "All right." So I was able to photograph is 18 layers, the original art by Jaime Hernandez, and then 17 layers of acetate on top, all
Incredible.
taped and perfect. And I want to call out also it's Roberta Gregory, right? Who
Yes,
she did, I
Roberta's
think
a
it was
great cartoonist.
Bitchy Bitch was her
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, was her comic, and I was able to reach her via email with help from Eric and said, "Do you remember doing this?" And I was able to include a quote from her. So I got a production person, artist in her own right, and you look at it. So I was able to photograph it separately and show that, and then also I took each of the layers, used Photoshop to digitally tint them, and then reassembled the acetate digitally. So it's a digital photostat reproduction next to the printed cover, and it's shocking how similar they look. It's like a testament to the processes they were using in the late 80s and early 90s. It were just I mean, the amount, like there's just such tiny slivers of this
Oh my God.
adhesive material, right?
Yeah.
You remember I
Oh
cutting
yeah,
that
yeah,
stuff
sure.
too. And it's
Ruby
like,
list,
oh,
man.
it's maddening, right? But you would
Yeah.
do it because you could get this fine detail and reproduced really sharp.
Yeah.
So anyway, so yeah, so I'm pleased to have this is my contribution from Fantagraphics.
Oh
Even though they
yeah.
don't do comic strips per se, they do reprints of comic strips. I have an original thing from them in there, which
And
I really
and that
appreciate.
goes to show, I mean, it goes to the point rather that there are so many wonderful reproductions in this book, and among those, of course, is the Peanuts comic that we referenced earlier. This is a wonderful one as well. Jaime Hernandez, and seeing that Ruby, that mechanical, is just incredible. And seeing the end result is also just
Oh,
that
so
whole
much fun
process.
to do it.
And you walk us through, there are many illustrations through the book that walk us through these processes. And then there's this whole great chapter on Doonesbury and the week that never was.
Oh
And
my gosh.
among the wonderful revelations there was that John Ehrlichman was a comics collector, which is, blows my mind. And this is a guy, he's right. Gary Trudeau is no fan of John Ehrlichman, and he's writing, very derogatory comics about the Nixon administration. And Ehrlichman is reaching out to him and asking, Trudeau for copies for the originals of these comics. It's like, this is a
Incredible.
totally different era, because I bet you, Trudeau goes after Trump, and man, they're going to come after him. I can just imagine what's going to happen to
Oh,
adversarial cartooning in the next few years.
people had shame in that era apparently too, but this was the useful thing. So primary research, like this is a mainstream book, it's written for
Yeah.
everyone to read, you don't need
Right.
any experience. But I also tried, I'd just gone through this experience with my mentor, and I'm like, I need to bring a rigorous focus, like I want to get as many primary materials as possible. So I go to the Beinecke Museum, and I was able to look at Gary's, he's donated everything, and he's just, you can just go there and be a researcher and say, I'd like to look at this. So I'm pulling out his sheaves of personal correspondence that he's received from the 70s, and I'm going through this because I was trying to find the Ehrlichman letters, and I reproduced in the book.
Yeah.
There are so many people in the Nixon administration who are like, oh, Mr. Trudeau, we love how you're skewering us, would you please send us original? They're so starstruck by the importance of his work,
Yeah.
even though he's making fun of them or destroying them,
It's
that they want a
incredible.
copy.
It's
Incredible.
incredible. Yeah,
There's some
can't
letters
imagine.
I oh,
I don't think anybody in current politics has that greatest sense of humor. And this is not to
no.
to venerate the Nixon administration, but
No,
never
no, not at
mind.
all.
It
But
was a
they had.
different era.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the only reasons I was comfortable including Ehrlichman in the book is he has sort of a redemption arc in that what happened? He was charged and convicted with crimes. He served his time in jail, and
Yeah.
then he went on to say, "What I did was wrong. I made wrong moral decisions, and I should never have accepted the blind faith in the president." And then he led a quiet life, and he wrote some books, and he made some appearances. He did not profit mightily, and he died in, I think, living in obscurity in New Mexico, being an art dealer. I don't know, something
But art,
wild or
wow.
something like that. I think it's like painting in New Mexico. So there's something about the fact that that really was the worst part of his life, the thing that he did that most was worst for the country. He kind of owned up to it, and so there is the fact that there's an arc for it. Like if it had been some other figure, I'd be like, I don't know,
Yeah.
Um, but the thing that's great is I advise anybody who ever gets an opportunity to look at cartoonist papers, go to the Billy Ireland. You can
Yeah.
just fill out requests. They'll
Oh,
bring
great.
stuff out for you. You go to Yale, to these other, like Yale. It's shocking. Yale has this huge collection of comic art. They have Gary's and Trudeau's, but not like everybody's. And you can read this stuff. You often are not. You can take photos. You just can't. You don't have reproduction permission. All the stuff that I was able to do, it's all on official government stationery, which is all by its nature.
Mhm.
It's not able. You cannot copyright government materials in the United States. So everything that's produced by or as an official record is out of copyright in nearly every case. But
Wow.
there are letters to Gary from Milt Caniff that are really neat. There's one
Oh,
from Al
cool.
Cap. There's some stuff in there that like I can't even quote from it because you need Al Cap's estate's permission to recite it.
My God.
But it's neat. It's neat to go learn. Milt Caniff. There's a couple excerpts of letters sent from newspapers to Milt Caniff very briefly, um, because it talks about the quality of
Yeah.
reproduction that he was so unhappy with.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And there's an instance where we see the cartoonist is, very concerned with the final product and how it
Yeah.
looks. And he's like, hey, look, I want this work done. I want you guys to see what you can do.
Yeah.
Is
And they were like, "Oh yeah, well we talked to people in the newsroom about it, or the print." They didn't really give
yeah.
them an answer on it. It was great.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and in newspapers, I don't know what the hierarchy, among the graphics people was, but we all know editors and whatnot for newspapers really had a dismissive view of the comic. They hated
Absolutely.
giving up space. And that has played out over the years, right? In the increasing or decreasing size of comics pages
Yeah.
over the years.
There's only a little little leverage they had. Like Milt Caniff, he could have said, "I'm not going to run my comic in your paper anymore," and that would have cost them readers in those days.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
Trudeau being able to say it has to be this size, or Bill Watterson saying it's going to be a half page. And then the thing that I found out, maybe you know this, I didn't know until doing the research. It's documented. Is he said, and his syndicate said, it has to be a half page format, unchanged. So publications that were already running a reduced tabloid size, they would run Calvin and Hobbes at a slight reduction. Like it wouldn't fill up the full half page width, but it would be in half page format. And apparently Watterson said, I think it's in one of the interviews, he's like, I had already gone through so many battles at that point. I just said, I can't fight it. It wasn't that many papers, but
Yeah.
the Doonesbury one, there were papers threatened to cancel Doonesbury. In the end, I think a few did, and then they all went back on it because it was just too much money. Too
Yeah.
many people
Too
bought
many
the paper
people.
for Doonesbury.
Yep.
Yeah, I try to explain to my kids that my kids are in their teens, 20, and
Yeah.
I'm like, there was a point at which the comics could set the agenda,
Yeah.
change a national discussion, or be the thing that a newspaper could lose tens of thousands of subscribers or more if
Oh
they
my
canceled
gosh.
a popular strip. And those days are
Absolutely,
sadly
absolutely.
gone.
And I know, right? I mean, I do miss those days when, when peanuts was an essential part of the culture. It wasn't, in the peripheral of the culture, periphery of the culture, but rather right was centrally located, and so was, you go back earlier than that, of course, predating my era or whatnot, but people like Milton Caniff. I mean, Terry
Hmm.
and the Pirates, or they Dick Tracy, you remember Fiero LaGuardia, reading the
Oh my
comics
God,
over
it's
there,
so great.
right? But
Yeah.
then there's also, in the 70s, it was Doonesbury, and Doonesbury was just like this, it was like a lightning rod, it was incredible, and its impact was incredible. And yeah, his satire really had an impact on the culture at large. What he
Yeah.
said mattered out in the world. And that was quite something, quite something. Comics
It's
really,
so long ago, right? And I
yeah.
mean, I sent the chapter to Gary for his review, so check facts, and his response was more or less like, "It happened so long ago, I can hardly believe it was me," you know.
Yeah.
And I'm like, "Yeah, I get that." I mean, I was, a kid at the time, but I'm like, I can get that. Like, I'm asking him questions like, "Do you remember in 1973 what you were like?"
God, yeah. Well, Glenn, this has been wonderful.
Oh, such a pleasure.
Really a pleasure. I'm glad we finally got together to do it. I appreciate your patience in waiting for me. But
I,
this has been wonderful, and I have really loved reading the book. It's a joy. Every page, the history itself is incredible and beautifully researched and detailed, and the reproductions are wonderful throughout. And it's, among those is the reproductions of Doonesbury and that flong of Doonesbury,
mm.
the week that never was, when John Ehrlichman got fired. And Gary Trudeau had to rush something else into print instead. Incredible. And it's incredible to see that flong, which is again, such a beautiful object unto
Well,
itself.
one of the reasons I made the book wide, it's kind of a comic book format, is I wanted to run strips wide, and that flong was the big thing. So it's a double page spread. It's nearly 20 inches wide. That flong appears. I think it's almost full size. It's fairly close to full size, and that was part of my thinking is the Sundays and the strips and everything. Didn't want to squeeze them in or cut them in half or rotate them. And I got, especially, this is me being a printing nerd, I got a lay flat binding. So you can open up, you don't have to break the spine.
Yeah.
You open it up
Oh,
and it lays flat and you can look all the way across it.
that's it. That is incredible. That is one of the wonderful things about that. And that's so true. In looking at that page, and I'm looking at it. Actually, I'm looking for it right now.
Those
And
blacks are so good. I
oh
really
my
love
God,
this printer.
fantastic.
It's Hemlock printers. I'll say them by name. They're just did lovely work, but they just hold. They have a rich black specification. Everybody in cartooning knows your rich blacks, right? So they gave me their
Yep.
formula. It's the rich black they can hold, and so it's four colors of black, and they can print huge fields of it. They're happy to do it. So there's those pages that are all
Oh,
black. This version also, I don't think Andrews McMeel's will probably be traditional screening, which will be great because it'll be very high screen frequency. This is stochastic screening, which is a frequency modulated screen, and as a result, instead of having dots, it actually has little tiny specks, and it does clusters of specks like dithering, but they're
oh,
so tiny. If you look under a loop, you can see them, but to the naked eye, the advantages, you can make out almost the tiniest lettering without any halftone breaks that you often
oh.
have with blow up. So when you look at some of the smallest things that reproduce in it, and some are, I just for space, I had to reproduce them very little, you can pull out a loop and you can read the type, and it's like -1 point type. It's so
Wow.
small, but
Incredible.
it's kind of like an Easter egg almost. It's almost it's not fractal, but it's just the dithering always, remember we used to
Yeah.
print with like inkjet printers, and it was always kind of coarse and weird, but it had a
Yeah.
certain style. This is dithering, but it's 100 times smaller, the dithering pattern. So it's just a different approach to screening, and it helps preserve detail, and it also makes those color fields. There's blues and pinks, and I knew we'd have lots of them. They look like flat spot color, and
Yes.
they're all process color.
So if
No.
folks want to know why this book is so rich in detail, I think you just had an example of why.
A
Because
nerd.
Glenn he is the best kind of printing nerd. So that's fantastic. It really
Thank
is.
you. And thank you
Yeah.
so much for the kind words about the book too.
Oh
Much
man, I
appreciated.
love it. I absolutely love it. And I'll be reading it again and again because it's chock a block full of stuff. And
I've already forgotten what's in it. It took so long to write it that I'm like, someone will ask me a question. I'm like, I need to refer to my own book to remember the answer to the
well,
question.
there's so much rich stuff in here,
Oh my
as I
gosh.
said. And that's not all of it, that we've covered, and it really is wonderful. So, and also for those who are listening, if you really want great definitions of all the terms we've been using, you get the book because that's where you'll find the definitions for flong and gamboge and bende and all of those things. So, anyway, well, Glenn, it's been great. I really
Oh,
enjoyed having you,
so nice.
and thanks for being here on Blockhead.
Thank you very much.
So there you have it. Wow. If that doesn't wet your whistle for this book, I don't know what will. It's a terrific book, and I can't recommend it enough. So be on the lookout for it. I'll put some info in the show notes to tell you where you can reach Glenn and where you might be able to get a hold of this. There are some copies still left, I think, from his initial print run, and it's a bit pricey, but it's well worth it. And again, if you can wait, it'll be out from Andrews McMeel sometime this year. So be looking for it. Well, so what about Blockhead? What about myself? What about what's going on? If you've been following the show since its inception, which is now 6 years ago in 2018, it's been through some changes. And this particular year, maybe the last 2 years, it's been really hard for me to keep up with it on a regular basis. It is an enormous amount of work unto itself. And I love doing the show, and I love talking to cartoonists and people like Glenn, who come on the show. And it's been so great for me personally to reach all of you, but also to have these great conversations. It's been a real privilege. And I don't want to give it up entirely. That it's infrequent in its publication history nowadays, and it's probably going to continue that way for some time. I can't see me getting back to a regular schedule anytime soon. It just takes so much work, and I've got so many other things I have to do these days. Not that I didn't always. I did, but somehow or another, the time seems to be slipping away more quickly these days. So where does that leave us? Well, what it means is that Blockhead is probably going to continue on an infrequent basis. And I don't know how often. I can't really commit to any particular schedule at this moment. I'm just hoping that there'll be more shows this year than there were last year. And we'll see. We did get some good shows out last year. We talked about Nancy. That was a lot of fun. And talking to Bill Griffith was a big joy, a big highlight of my life as a cartoonist and a podcaster. So there was that, and I'm hoping there'll be more interesting and fun things going forward, but I can't. It's hard to promise. So I hope you'll stay with the show. I hope you'll continue to subscribe and be looking for it. But I don't know where it's going at this moment. So we'll see. So that does it for this episode, and I have something in mind, hopefully maybe for an episode coming up. Hope to maybe get that together sometime soon. So you can follow me on Bluesky. Look up Geoff Grogan, or my address is at jeffgcomics.bsky.social. So find me there. I'm not going to be on Instagram any longer. So long, Zuckerberg. So long, Meta. I'm so glad that you're out there listening, and I know a bunch of you have been there for a long time, and I'm thankful for all of you who've stuck with it for these years, these several years now. And, it's nice to know that you're there. And as always, thanks for listening.